Give us your best definition of Jim Crow laws.
Jim Crow. I have no idea.
Don't even know what that is. What? What'd you say?
Jim Crow laws?
I don't know what that is.
Okay.
Laws? I don't know what they are.
Do you guys know what Jim Crow laws are?
Can you give us your best definition of what a Jim Crow law is?
Basically a law that is aimed more towards one racial minority or another.
So Jim Crow, historically speaking, was legally mandated segregation, and was not just about segregation in terms of like social spaces.
According to Keisha Gaskins of the Brennan Center for Justice, after the Civil War, America saw the inception of the Jim Crow era, which brought the passage of more than 400 laws between 1865 and 1967, legalizing segregation in all areas of American life. Some examples of these laws legalizing segregation included this law from Birmingham, Alabama, 1930, stating it shall be unlawful for a Negro and white person to play together or in company with each other in any game of cards or dice, dominoes, or checkers. Other laws included ones like Oklahoma's 1915 law that stated, "The Corporate Commission is hereby vested with power to require telephone companies in the state of Oklahoma to maintain separate booths for white and colored patrons when there is demand for such separate booths." Arkansas had a 1903 law that said it shall be unlawful for any white prisoner to be handcuffed or otherwise chained or tied to a Negro prisoner. A law from Atlanta, Georgia in 1926 declared no colored barber shall serve as a barber to white women or girls. Nebraska's 1911 law stated marriages are void when one party is a white person and the other is a possession of 1/8 or more Negro, Japanese, or Chinese blood. The 1929 Missouri law that pronounced separate free schools shall be established for the education of children of African descent, and it shall be unlawful for any colored child to attend any white school or any white child to attend a colored school. Maryland's 1924 law that said, any white woman who shall suffer or permit herself to be got with child by a Negro or mulatto shall be sentenced to the penitentiary for not less than 18 months. And the 1891 Tennessee law that stated all railroads carrying passengers in the state, other than street railroads, shall provide equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races, by providing 2 or more passenger cars for each passenger train, or by dividing the cars by a partition so as to secure separate accommodations. But while these Jim Crow laws have been legally stricken from the books, some of the laws are so ingrained in the minds of the American public that they remain in practice nonetheless.
Do you think the Jim Crow laws ended?
In some places no.
Legally, yes. Socially, no.
One area where discrimination akin to that of the Jim Crow era can still be seen today is in the United States prison system. According to the Western Journal of Black Studies, African American men between the ages of 15 and 35, a group that represents less than 5% of the overall U.S. population, accounts for upwards of 50% of the prison inmates. And in fact, according to projections, almost 1/3 of black males born in 2001 will be locked up in a state or federal prison during their lifetimes, as opposed to just 6% of white males.
So how would you explain the disproportionate levels of minorities, especially African Americans, in the U.S. prison system?
I would say that a lot of people think that more of them are like in the prison system than white people, but like I feel like there's an equal balance of both.
I think minorities are generally in like lower SES, and those are like more likely to be part of violence or like crimes, I guess.
I honestly don't know, but I feel like there's probably more people lean towards judging the minority more.
As scholar Michelle Alexander stated in her 2013 TED Talk, today there are more African Americans under correctional control, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. A large reason for these high numbers of black males in correctional facilities, as Coretha Mitchell writes, is simply that it is especially profitable, so racial marginalization remains one of empire's most important collaborators. Routinely casting people of color as guilty and whites as innocent is violence. Some might call it discursive violence, but its effects are not simply symbolic. Misrepresentation amounts to character assassination for people of color. In this vein of character assassination comes the view of the black man. The American public has been convinced of the image of a black man as a rapist for a very long time, with considerable help from movies, books, and other propaganda. This propaganda has not stopped in modern times. It has only shifted. Now the public sees African American men as inherently criminal, and very few question the system that imprisons disproportionate amounts of them. Furthermore, many people think that opposing the system of mass incarceration is the same as supporting crime, erasing the idea of brown and black innocence. These working-age African-American men that are either under correctional control or branded felons are then, for the rest of their lives, subject to legalized discrimination. Although Jim Crow laws are now off the books, millions of blacks arrested for minor crimes remain marginalized and disenfranchised, trapped by a criminal justice system that has forever branded them as felons and denied them basic rights such as the right to vote, the right to serve on juries, the right to be free of legal discrimination, and opportunities that would allow them to become productive, law-abiding citizens. Once they've been branded felons, they're suddenly allowed to be legally discriminated against in ways that we supposedly left behind in the Jim Crow era. These forms of racism we thought we left behind have left a stain in our society in a belief that a racist mindset can accomplish anything, because it already has. Effects of the Jim Crow era, these toxic mindsets of racism, can be seen in many contemporary areas. For example, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Dr. Charles Walker wrote in the Journal of Theory, Construction, and Testing, in 1932, the U.S. government promised 399 African-American men free treatment for bad blood, a euphemism for syphilis, which was an epidemic in Macon County, Alabama. All of the men were residents of Macon County. All were poor and uneducated, and none of them received the promised treatment. The men became unwitting participants in a government-sanctioned medical investigation, the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, which lasted 4 decades and had nothing to do with treatment. No new drugs were tested. The efficacy of old treatment modalities were neither confirmed nor refuted, and when a definitive treatment for syphilis became available in 1942, it was withheld. Participants were uninformed, and deception was used throughout. One survivor noted, "I don't know what they used us for. I ain't never understood the study." Misleading letters were sent to participants encouraging their submission to painful diagnostic procedures and post-mortem autopsies. For a few months, the men received exceedingly low, non-therapeutic doses of mercurial ointment and bismuth, which were somewhat effective but quite toxic treatments of the day. However, funding never materialized to pay for extended treatment. Instead of calling a halt to the study, U.S. Public Health Service investigators decided to salvage their work by compiling data on spontaneous evolution of syphilis and its effects on African American males. The scientific objective was to compare the pathological manifestations of untreated syphilis documented at Tuskegee with findings of an earlier study conducted in Oslo, Norway, but there was a big difference. The Oslo study had been a retrospective investigation in which the researchers pieced together information from syphilitic white males who had remained untreated for a long time prior to the study's start in 1928. In modern times, racism can be seen in other areas too. There are still many problems with racism where people live. According to Holloway in the American Historical Review, segregated urban neighborhoods became another space of confinement for black people. It's been such a common problem for African Americans to be seen as poor and criminal that many have trouble with getting decent housing in a good neighborhood, in addition to fearing the discrimination and problems associated with living in a predominantly white neighborhood. There are everyday problems beyond housing that affect black people's lives as well. According to Bobo in the journal Daedalus, these problems included poor schooling, poor health, and greater exposure to disorder and crime. A large amount of these issues tend to originate from the aforementioned idea that black people are criminals. To the American public, so many black people appear to be incarcerated that they are generalized, labeled criminal and delinquent from the start. According to Catherine McKittrick in Social and Cultural Geography, The attempt for black people to find a home gets interrupted due to the criminalization of non-white bodies because of the increased crime in largely black-populated areas.
And so when we get new policies from the federal government, like the war on crime and like the war on drugs, essentially those kind of get sutured onto existing policing strategies. So when the federal government begins to encourage police to lock up drug offenders, police are already focused on black neighborhoods, and so that's where they concentrate themselves.
In the search for a black sense of place, many black people are coming to identify themselves with incarceration. This makes them inherently subject themselves to the idea that they are an inferior race when compared to whites. This inequality causes them to believe that they are criminals by nature.
Be my woman, girl, I'll be your man. Be my woman, girl, I'll be your man.
Some African Americans were able to overcome the labeling as criminal because of the Black Power movement. Pippa Holloway in the American Historical Review says, over the course of the movement, prisoners shifted from being seen universally as marginalized and degraded troublemakers to, at least for some, being viewed as intellectual leaders and political heroes. The Jim Crow laws may have been abolished, but the impacts of them ring through to today. It is important to notice what these laws have done to affect modern-day America. If people understand the effects, only then can we begin to rid our nation of the pre-existing prejudices many of our citizens unknowingly hold in their subconscious.
How do you think people as individuals can stop racism and discrimination? I think learning about it is a big one. I am just starting to learn more about it because I don't really know a lot. But I think the more you know, the more you can be aware of it and start to fight it. But if you don't know, you can't really do anything about it.
I think we're doing stuff where we could always do more.